Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. I have Sophia in my lap. She's being great. And I'm here with Shelby from my mom in Winchester, obviously always. This is part 5 of the lecture series for Sartre's Sketch for a Theory of the Emotions. And let me double check that. Yeah, that's right. And um it may be the last one, but I might have to do a sixth or even a seventh one. We have 30 pages left, and it's kind of complex, and I want to do it justice. So, um, let me get some things moved around. Okay. My mouse is missing, so let me pause and find that. All right, I found my mouse. Which means I can drag windows around and do things much easier. Uh, Screen share. I don't know why. I think she just marks her territory. You can see she's like rubbing her jowls on my desk edge. She does it on a lot of edges. She might be itching herself, but I think my sister said there are like pheromones in the jowls. I don't know. Whatever. Not super important. All right. Got the split screen set up. So the guiding question, how does emotion, Sartre's already kind of explained that his understanding of emotion is that it's a transformation of the world. But there's a lot more to that, and he fleshes it out with some different ideas. He's critiqued the unconscious, and he'll emphasize the non-reflective plane of consciousness instead. Just because something is not reflective does not mean that it's not our responsibility or that we could not direct our attention to it if we became more proficient in recognizing when it's there. Um, I would say that there's also so how does emotion as a transformation of the world, which is his definition, imply and provide evidence for the reality of the magical world, i.e., for the world as fundamentally magical? So he says that emotion is a magical behavior, but by the end of the chapter, changes it to he changes in his interpretation to saying that emotion reveals the magical world. It throws us back into the quote original magic. The social world is always magical, and man is always a sorcerer to man. Um, and the magical attitude, which the attitudes are kind of I'm not super well versed in them in phenomenology, but I know they're common in phenomenology, and like the main one is the natural attitude, which Husserl says we should avoid, and we do that through the phenomenological reduction. So the natural attitude is like our everyday kind of um, uncritical, passive existence. But if we start bracketing things and trying to identify patterns or eidetic consistencies or convictions about what the essences of things are, and commit ourselves to things, then with some effort and some degree of strained perception, then we can leave the natural attitude. Um, Sartre doesn't list all of the attitudes, but he says that the magical attitude is one of the like common ones or archetypal ones. I'll see exactly how he says it for you. We'll read it too, but I'll jump ahead and see. On the contrary, it is the return of consciousness to the magical attitude, one of the great attitudes which are essential to it, with the appearance of the correlative world, the magical world. Emotion is not an accident. It is a mode of our conscious existence, one of the ways in which consciousness understands its being in the world, understands in Heidegger's sense of Verstehen, I'm not sure. Um, and so he says that consciousness can be in the world in two different ways. Um, in the deterministic world where we manipulate things, and in the magical world where, we have emotions and we try to change the outcome of the world by our changing our bodies instead and changing our attitude, so to speak. Um, we can understand grief in this way. Grief in all of its stages is an attempt to change up until acceptance. is an attempt to change through anger, through bargaining, through denial, through fear, through fainting away, through crying, through sobbing. I mean, it's all ways of trying to change the deterministic world, and that's not always possible, it seems. Um, I mean, Sartre opens up the magical world for us in a way that we might wonder if we can love hard enough to like quote unquote bring back the dead. That sounds crazy. But if there were like a messianic return of heaven on earth, it would be something like that, where belief and care and love and desire could overcome death itself. That all sounds crazy until we get through this and until you've done some phenomenology. Um, he mentions that we have to, it's kind of in the middle, but he says that we have to remember that the body is lived in two ways. We must remember clearly to understand the emotional process. This is on page 50. As it proceeds from consciousness, we must remember the dual nature of the body, which on the one hand is an object in the world and on the other is immediately lived by the consciousness. Only then can we grasp what is essential, that emotion is a phenomenon of belief. That's really interesting and direct. Belief determines what emotions we have. We truly believe the play acting that we do when we transform the world. It's non-reflective. It's not something we're reflectively conscious of doing or emerging. Um, but it is still our responsibility. It is still the consciousness is doing, and it's truly believed as a survival strategy. It's truly an attempt to survive and change the world. Um, he says it's not play acting, it's when we truly believe. Anyway, emotion then cannot be regarded simply as play acting. It is not mere behavior, but the behavior of a body which is in a specific state. The state itself will not give rise to the behavior. The behavior without the state is play acting, but the emotion appears in a disordered body carrying on a certain kind of behavior. Even though the body is disordered, the emotion still has an orderliness to it and a coherence, right? Because the disorder of the explanatory theories of the explanations of the classic theories was should have for Sartre, he says it should have been diffuse, and it wasn't diffuse. It took on it was a sort of upheaval, and it was still controlled, and it had a finality. There is something else we should very clearly mention. On page 35, um, Dembo is a woman. Dembo, the T. Dembo author is Tamara Dembo. And my understanding, she's a Russian psychologist. My understanding is that she's one of the pioneers of psychological field theory with Kurt Lewin. Um, and they are both from the Kohler school. I don't have Kohler pulled up right now, but Giame was lesser known. I actually had to find the Wikipedia page from the French Wikipedia and then translate it. And so it's kind of wonky, but he's not even in. Um, he's like obscure outside of France, I guess, outside of French culture. And but yeah, I don't think because this was originally written in French and the gender is implied in French, I don't think that Sartre, I don't know, maybe Sartre in the original French does misgender Dembo on page 35. The English translation that I have, I can actually pull it up right here. I don't have it circled here because I didn't catch this until I did background research on who these people are, and obviously the sexism um, as a as a default kind of prioritizes assuming, unless you actively attend to it, assuming that any person you read would use the he pronoun, um, is a male researcher or a male doctor. There's a whole Key and Peele skit on about a pirate captain who's a woman, and they're talking the whole time about about these like prejudiced assumptions and stories. They tell stories and then like, oh, but you probably assumed that. And the woman captain would like kill any sexist member of her crew. Um, so actually a pretty good political critique there. And That's what happened, I think, with the translator probably. But I would have to look at the original French, and I would want to alert Routledge to this because that seems like a major issue. Um, I would also mention this is a 2014 edition, so it's 11 years now. It could be time for a new one. Also that peripheric uh pheric thing, that's on page 28. So further up on page 28. And these are like the two things I don't think I've noticed much else that was super wrong with it. Um, there's just peripheric space pheric, Pheric, theory of James. So that's just another typo. Don't remember if I marked anything else out in this one at least. Okay. But yeah, like that seems like a major issue. Tamara Dembo was a woman, not a man. Um, and Lewin was like considered a founder of social psychology. Um, Wikipedia says that one of the modern pioneers of social organizational applied psychology, one of the first to study group dynamics and organizational development. So I'm thinking like IO, institutional organizational psych. And what I understand about the field theory stuff is that it's pretty close to what Sartre's talking about, but they actually do have a function formula for like if you input the behavior will be an output of the inputs for the person and the environment together. So the total field of like psychological person, their environments, their history, their interpretations, and their behaviors and their states of consciousness, all of that taken together will determine the person's behavior. And it will differ from person to person. And they use person in a couple of different ways. I didn't dig too deep into it, but this is just kind of what I remember from trying to learn about it and develop a background understanding. And so that's why Sartre says that it's functional. And it was functional for, if I'm not mistaken, it was functional for Janet as well, but not for James. And then he finds it more functional in the work of Dembo and Lewin, as we read with Giame. And and that function just means that it's like a mechanical input-output situation. Um, which Sartre doesn't necessarily disagree with, but he wants to maintain the agency and the psychic being and the finality and the moreness of consciousness, the cogito, it would seem, right? And the principality of eidetic reasoning and eidetic perceptions. Um, so yeah, keeping in mind the dual nature of the body as a thing in the world, but also as lived by consciousness, we find that there are really two worlds. The world as things that can be manipulated and deterministic, and the world as consciousness, which is social and magical and has all of its determinism stripped away. So we go to the magical world whenever the determinisms fall apart. And so that's why it's a function of our inability to do certain things. An emotion has a function to transform the world in a way. So it plays a function. That's how Sartre uses it. And he goes over, he's already gone over anger and he says, like, we don't need to recover anger. We don't need to do it again. But he goes over passive fear and active fear. And then he goes over passive sadness and active sadness. Covers melancholy. Uh, he has really interesting kind of metaphors and for talking about things like little demon. We already saw the exigences. So we'll talk about, I'll come to that in a second. So yeah, active sadness, and then he says we don't need to worry about anger, like I said, and then joy. And I've mentioned this in the first episode that joy is a way of trying to attain the object or the goal or the loved one or the friend or whatever all at once without being realistic about what you have to do that. Um, and then so he says they However, we cannot be quite content with these few observations. They have enabled us to appreciate the functional part played by emotion, right? Each of them had a different function, a different reason or way that Sartre interpreted it, that in Sartre interpreted it, that emotion, as transforming the world to fulfill a function. Um, we'll read each one, but I don't really want to cover all of them. Fear is like is fainting away because you can't overcome the thing that's a threat. And sadness is flattening the world because you don't have the resources to deal with, um, you get kind of melancholic because you'd have to change your resources. Like you don't have a car anymore, so you have to take the bus. But instead of doing all that, you just get sad. And then he says many other fears are possible, many other kinds of sadness are possible. And so even though we had the function, we still do not know very much about its nature. So then he's going to try to talk about the nature. Um, this is where it gets a little more. I want to back up though. He's about to talk about the body. So this is where he talks about belief. It's an incantation by the body through bodily reactions that we fully believe. And those bodily reactions are happening non-reflectively, which just means, so let's go back and talk about reflective and non-reflective. Um, reflective just means that it's folded on itself. Yeah. Um, so it's helpful to think about thetic consciousness and non-thetic consciousness first before we think about reflective and non-reflective consciousness. Thetic consciousness is where non-thetic consciousness is the peripheral consciousness of what you're perceiving. Thetic consciousness is what you are focused on, right? So in your conscious field of consciousness, quote unquote, um, you have direct perceptions wherever your attention is directed, but you're also getting the adumbrations, the edges of that, the non-thetic perceptions, the non-thetic consciousness. It's only reflective consciousness when the thetic position of consciousness is flipped back on itself, like in the cogito and like in apperception by Leibniz, where apperception is perception of perception. So that's how Sartre understands reflective consciousness. And he'll give a lot of examples. So the first like 3 or 4 pages. Um, the first 6 pages are explaining using these terms and making the arguments about and giving examples to help you think through like writing is one of them, problem solving is one of them. So you have some kind of non-reflective experience in the world, and then you imposes a challenge on you, and then you go back to your like mind, and you're like, how do I solve this? And then you go back to the world, and it's non-reflective again, and then you have another challenge, and you go back to your mind, and it's reflective again. And he says it doesn't happen like that. Oftentimes, we don't really need to become reflective of ourselves to try a new solution. The um, one example he gives is like directions. Directions under a word search or an image search. Find such and such in this image. He uses the example of a gun. Find a gun in this image of like trees or something. And he says that's the non-reflective stimuli that tells us what to do. So then we just start doing that, but we don't ever have to fold back on ourselves to think about what we're doing, to regroup. Um, oftentimes that would get in the way of doing these things. That's why he doesn't think there's an unconscious, but there are still all of these dimensions of the non-thetic and non-reflective consciousness um, that can become thetic. And when they're thetic, they can still be non-reflective, like the genesis of an emotion or something that we're not paying attention to in our environment that we then learn to direct our attention onto. Maybe it is some kind of like bodily reaction or a meditative mindfulness, right? But the point is that we are still agents with our emotion. So going back to the two types of world, to the dual nature of the body, we are simultaneously affirming like Spinozan affectivity, where um, causation is deterministic, and the reason you love things and do things can, on the one hand, be seen from the third person in such a way that they, you know, what ended up happening was necessary, and there are bundles of adequate causation far beyond my body that I may not be aware of. But even in Spinoza, with this, intellect or intellection was the process of perceiving the cause and effect relationships so vastly that you could navigate these procedures or these realities, these causal relationships. You could navigate um, to amplify power and nourish life, where arete is really about, or excellence and virtue is really about the value that you can bring to stability and sustaining ethics, goodness, and life. I said this back in the Plato series. Um, but we have all that on the one hand with the third person, the deterministic world. And Sartre's not really denying any of that. Um, he's thoroughly intersubjective, thoroughly historical, but he's also kind of like excoriating or um, fearsome about our ethical responsibility. So yeah, that's like the general contour of section three, the general structure of the argument. We have thetic and non-thetic consciousness, reflective and non-reflective consciousness. She sometimes bites. Um, she doesn't actually like bite. She doesn't pierce my skin. I think she's playing right now though, which is good. She doesn't usually play. She sometimes plays. Okay, anyway, I think we have enough to start chewing on it, and like you're primed and we could go. So I'm going to close the tabs on the psychologists. Just wanted to give a little bit of background about what we were reading before. And again, our guiding question is, how does emotion as a transformation of the world imply and provide evidence for the reality of the magical world, i.e., for the world as fundamentally magical? And so if you can see the screen, it's worth looking at this kind of diagram about thetic and non-thetic consciousness. It's reflective when thetic consciousness is focused back onto itself, onto the viewer, onto consciousness, onto perception. Um, I'll read these descriptions kind of verbatim. Thetic consciousness is consciousness of an object with a finite specific position. And non-thetic consciousness is background, peripheral noise, context, setting, or non-focal consciousness. Even those historical things are probably non-thetic. Um, the adumbrations. So Sartre uses the German word Abschattungen, which I think means adumbrations, but it's the way that that everything is an elemental expression of the whole of nature and reality, and the way that the surface givenness of any perception um, connects up with, without being like a Platonic form, but is instead like an indexes alongside the other things that the singularities of other things of that nature that are associated with it for one reason or another. Um, And for Sartre as an existentialist, he doesn't deny, right? We've seen that he doesn't deny eidetics, he doesn't deny essences. Um, but he does create a sort of imminent existence first, not materialist, but in itselfness, imminence of and Deleuze quotes him in Imminence of Life. He doesn't quote him, he cites him the transcendental ego, I think is what it is. I have the text right here. Let me see. Um, so this is the second footnote for the essay, the short essay, Eminence of Life, which is the next lecture series for us. And that's why I put them together. Not really, actually. I found it out right after, but it made a lot of sense. It kind of made sense, and then I found that he cited him. Cross-reference Jean-Paul Sartre, who posits a transcendental field without a subject that refers to a consciousness that is impersonal, absolute, immanent. I mean, we're kicking tail here. This is some high-level stuff. With respect to it, the subject and the object are transcendents. And then he also quotes William James in the same footnote. So this is how he's thinking of consciousness. And this is why the adumbration of non-thetic consciousness is entirely given on the surface in any thetic perception. Shelby, Shelby. Okay. And then non-reflective consciousness is base level, first order consciousness of the world or the activity. So it's like the thing that's always happening. That's the trend, like the, what did he call it? A transcendental field without a subject. But I didn't even tell you what essay that was. That's the transcendence of the ego. La transcendance de l'ego. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. Um, I need to work on my French, but still working on my Spanish. And I don't want to get them confused. So then reflective consciousness, like I've been saying, is self-referential consciousness, awareness or perception of the origin, seat, or perspective of consciousness. It's doubled back upon itself. It's consciousness of consciousness as the thetic object or the thetic focal point, when consciousness is its own focus or object of study. Metacognition in psychology is kind of this. That's cognition of cognition, thinking about thinking. But in phenomenology, reflective consciousness is actually the perceptive act that focuses back on the perceptive act or the ongoing perceiving. And the intentionality structure would be with this perceiving as well, because the intentionality structure is a mutual perception between the world and the subject or the perceiver, the seat, um, the transcendent with a T, which is like the particular that comes out of the undistributed consciousness, the immanent life. Because for Deleuze, life is the sort of self necessary principle that pursues its furthering, and from life or a life comes immanence, and then immanence produces transcendence, and transcendence with a CE produces the particular transcendent of subject and object in relation to each other. Um, that's just looking ahead. That's not, it'll help you kind of think about the Sartre stuff. So I'm just trying to explain the thetic and non-thetic and the reflective and the non-reflective consciousness. And okay, there are a lot more notes um, on this Instagram post. You can go find them. Each of the posts have their caption is like a citation format version of what the lecture was, where it was, what sections it was with. This one is obviously Jean-Paul Sartre's Sketch for Theory of the Emotions. But yeah, if you want to look at these, you can. I might type them up one day. Probably not, because they're not whole phrases. They're just copying. They're not whole sentences, they're just copying phrases from the text, key phrases. And that's why they weren't in my text the first time, and this time around I had to go reread it and write all those things in there. And there's probably a lot of overlap between what I wrote in these notes and the annotations, but that's great because now I know it better. I want to make sure there's nothing, no more graphics or diagrams. One thing I thought I might do with these notes is have them in sections. So maybe read like I took the time, it's not in the digital copy, but I took the time in my copy for section 3 to go back in with purple and make some more things. Um, I didn't reread it again, but I kind of scanned it and the annotations along the outside to see where the beats were because I'm familiar with it by now. So I marked like 5 or 6 different beat shifts, and that helped me to present the information that I just presented you the last 30 minutes. Um, but I was thinking also that I could use those beat shifts to read these notes, to kind of again prime the section, and then we'll read kind of like scanning the headings that are coming up. Um, and then we'll read those 4 pages or whatever, and we'll go back to the notes for the next section, the next 5 pages or whatever. And I thought that might help. So we're gonna go up to 39. All right. Um, and against the primacy of reflective consciousness, consciousness of itself versus of the world, the emotional subject and the object of the emotion are united in an indissoluble synthesis. Apprehending the world, consciousness is outside in the world, turn back upon itself and interpose a reflective consciousness. Passage from non-reflective action to non-reflective anger as a quality of the world. You don't need to go to reflective consciousness to struggle in the deterministic world and then get angry about your struggles. You don't need to be like it often is not very conscious or like something you could prevent. Reflective consciousness is self-awareness or metacognition, thinking of thinking, right? Page 36. That was all from page 34. Page 36, and it might have been 35 too, but I kind of tried to signpost on the left-hand side um, where the pages were, what pages these were from. Misconception of unreflecting behavior as a passage back and forth with reflective consciousness. Action as requiring movement to the plane of reflection. Writing is conscious insofar as it is intentional, but is not reflective as self-conscious activity. Reflective consciousness as literally mirrored reflection back on itself. Objective exigence. Um, so, quote, the exigence of the words that I am tracing is directly present, weighty, and felt. They impel and direct my hand. Um, an exigence is an urgent need or demand. It's the way that the world pulls actions out from the subject or from myself or yourself, um, from any given body or seat of perception, any cogito. The exigences of like this lecture needs to be recorded. And so then there's a further exigence of like, I need to have better annotations or exigences to like prepare food and put it in the freezer so that you are because you know you're going to be hungry more. Or like I just had to thaw some food yesterday. I pulled it out of the freezer and it's still frozen in the fridge, but it's thawing because I know that I'm going to need I've used up but those are they pull things out of you. Um, he says the book that needs to be read, the shoe that needs to be mended, maybe the friend he doesn't talk about other examples of like the friend that you should call or um anyway. He does talk about consciousness as like my consciousness. He says, well, I don't have any notes about the positional and the non-positional mode, but he says that non-reflective consciousness is not thetic of self, like we've been saying, except in the non-positional mode, which means that he's asserting that my consciousness of this book or my perception on this book, my awareness, this whole phenomenal field around me is myself or is ourself, but is only ourself insofar as it is non-positional. Or it's not reflective of myself insofar as it's non-positional. Maybe we can parse that better when we get to it. In order to act, there is no need to be conscious of oneself as acting. Unreflective conduct is not unconscious conduct. Non-thetic consciousness, no specific object or position, conscious of self by transcending and apprehending itself out in the world as a quality of things. That's kind of what I was trying to talk about. Non-reflective consciousness is not thetic of itself, a quality of the world given to perception. The noetic correlate of the activity, conceive what an emotion is, a transformation. Oh, so on page 39, he then says, we can now conceive of what an emotion is. There was some other stuff on the side, though. Consciousness of the world is non-reflective, non-thetic consciousness of self out in the world as a quality of things, mindness. And it's mind for each person, each time for each one, for each cogito. Consciousness of the world is non-reflective. Consciousness is objective insofar as it can itself be an object of study, thetic. Um, and so because you can, in the same way that the body is a thing in the world, because you can turn your attention onto it, just because you can have reflective consciousness at that moment, consciousness becomes an object as well as a subject. And it's this multiplicity, but or this dual simultaneity, this dual nature of subject object hyphen of unity multiplicity of body world of consciousness body of mind matter quote unquote mind body, the simultaneity of them that brings about all of these apparent contradictions. But still consonant with Spinoza to say that they run in opposite track, not opposite tracks, but non-conflicting tracks, parallel tracks, so to speak. Um, so yeah, we're not going to do page 39 because that's the beat shift. So let's look at all this like thetic, non-thetic, reflective, non-reflective stuff. We will do page 39, just not yet, on the notes and on the reading. Okay, so we're finally going to read Sartre himself. Page 34, outline, section 3, outline of a phenomenological theory. And this is the last section. It goes for about 28 pages, and then there are 27 to 28 pages, and then there are 3 pages in the conclusion. And that's it. Perhaps it will assist us in our research to make a preliminary observation, one which might serve towards a general criticism of all the theories of emotion we have encountered, with the possible exception of Dembo's. For the majority of psychologists, everything happens as though the consciousness of emotion were primarily a reflective consciousness. That is, as if the primary form of emotion, as a fact of consciousness, were its appearance to us as a modification of our psychic being, or, to use ordinary language, its being grasped first of all as a state of mind. And certainly, it is always possible to become aware of emotion as a fact of consciousness, reflective. As when we say, I'm angry, I'm afraid, etc. But the fear does not begin as consciousness of being afraid, any more than the perception of this book, or this lecture, or this podcast, is consciousness of perceiving it. There's a sort of passive, non-reflective absorption happening. Which really, if you learn this, it can free you up to just kind of move and do things without waiting for this like mythic reflective capacity at the same time as the movement. You can just throw yourself into an activity, basically. The emotional consciousness is at first non-reflective, and upon that plane, it cannot be consciousness of itself except in the non-positional mode. This is what I was saying. And it doesn't quite make sense unless you think about all the other stuff, but it really does mean that we share the world. Um, The emotional consciousness is primarily consciousness of the world, which is the intentionality structure, and the consciousness is always consciousness of something. But specifically with emotion, it's consciousness of the world. There is no need to call to mind the whole theory of consciousness in order to understand this principle clearly. A few simple observations will suffice, and it is remarkable that the psychologists of emotion have never thought of making them. It is obvious indeed that the man who is frightened is afraid of something. Even if it is a case of one of those indefinite anxieties that one feels in the dark, in a sinister and deserted alley, etc., it is still of certain aspects of the night or of the world that one is afraid. And without doubt, all the psychologists have noted that emotion is touched off by some perception, a representative signal, etc. But for them, as it appears, emotion then parts company with the object to become absorbed in itself. Little reflection is needed to discover that, on the contrary, emotion returns to the object every moment and feeds upon it. They describe flight and fear, for instance, as though the flight were not first and foremost a flight from a certain object, as though that object did not remain constantly in the act of flight as its theme, the reason for it, as what one is fleeing from. And how can we speak about anger, in which one strikes, reviles, and threatens, without mentioning the person who represents the objective unity of all those insults, menaces, and blows? In a word, the emotional subject and the object of the emotion are united in an indissoluble synthesis. Emotion is a specific manner of apprehending the world. That is what Dimbo alone has a glimpse of. Although she, the typo is in the text here, it says he, and I think it's from the translation, but Tam or Dimbo is woman. Although she does not give a reason for it. The subject who is seeking the solution of a practical problem is outside in the world. He, the subject, not Dimbo, the hypothetical subject out and seeking the solution of a practical problem outside in the world. He is aware of the world at every moment throughout all his actions. Although this should be a colon instead of a comma. This is a run-on sentence. And it could be in the French too. There are other things like that with the but starting at the beginning and right here at the beginning. So I'm not too worried about those things. But um, grammatically, I'd like for my students to understand at least that you don't do those things. He is aware of the world at every moment throughout all his actions. If he fails in his attempt and grows irritated, the irritation itself is still a way in which the world appears to him. And it is not necessary that the subject, between his failure in action and his anger, should turn back upon himself and interpose a reflective consciousness. There may be continuous passage from the non-reflective consciousness, instrumental world action, to the non-reflective consciousness, hateful world anger. The latter is a transformation of the former. Okay, so this is what I was saying earlier. Um, you don't need to go back to the reflective consciousness to go from frustrated in the world over like a problem you can't solve to an angry response at not being able to solve that. Which is what we saw with the geometry example, as well as the example of like being in a fight of jeers with your friend and not being able to think of something clever or funny to say or witty to say, and then getting angry because you can't think of something witty and you don't become reflective about it. The latter, the non-reflective consciousness hateful world of anger, is a transformation of the former non-reflective consciousness instrumental world of action. I need to pause right here because Sophia used the litter box, and I'm not going to spend the next 2 hours or however long it's going to take recording with that going on. Hey guys, welcome back, or kind of welcome back. Welcome back for me. Um, I got Shelby here now, and she might run off because she's a little wiggly. Uh, if you're not looking or you can't see, she's not a cat. She is a King Charles Spaniard miniature. It's my mom's. Normally very sweet, so she might stick around. Okay, anyway, um, yeah, I took care of the cat litter and lit some Hinoki incense, so it's maybe that's somewhat relatable for other animal owners or animal lovers. Anyway, let's continue with Sartre, page 36. For a better understanding of what is to follow, the reader will need to recall to mind the essence of unreflecting behavior. We tend too easily to believe that action involves a constant passing from the non-reflective to the reflective, from the world to oneself. That is, that we grasp the problem, non-reflective consciousness of the world, then we see ourselves as having the problem to resolve, reflection, and that then, starting from that reflection, we conceive an action insofar as it has to be performed by us, reflection, after which we go down again into the world to perform the action, no longer conceiving of it as performed by us, non-reflectively, now thinking only of the object acted upon. Thereafter, any new difficulties, any partial failures that require readjustment of means, send us back to the plane of reflection. According to this view, a constant movement inward and outward is constitutive of action. And remember, he started that whole passage with, we tend too easily to believe. So he's critiquing that view. Now, it is certain that we can reflect upon our activity, but an operation upon the universe is generally executed without our having to leave the non-reflective plane. For example, at this moment, I am writing, but I am not conscious of writing, which is interesting to think about that. And I'm probably not really conscious. When I become conscious of myself as lecturing, I tend to kind of falter and get stuck because I'm not moving with the structure of the activity of the world. Will someone say that the habit has rendered me unconscious of the movements made by my hand in tracing the letters? That would be absurd. I may have the I'm still conscious of it, but I'm conscious on the thing I'm doing. I may have the habit of writing, but not at all that of writing such words in such an order, or of lecturing on such topics in such an order. In a general way, one should always distrust habit as an explanation. In reality, the act of writing is not at all unconscious. It is an actual structure of my consciousness. Only it is not conscious of itself. To write is to maintain an active awareness of the words as they come to birth under my pen, not of the words inasmuch as they are written by me. I apprehend the words intuitively inasmuch as they have that structural quality, that they emerge ex nihilo and yet do not create themselves. Ex nihilo means from nothing, that they are passively created. At the actual moment when I write a word, I am not paying attention individually to each pothook formed under my hand. I am in a special state of attention, creative attention. I wait for the word, which I know in advance, to employ the hand, that is writing it, and the pothooks it is tracing, and thus to realize itself. Saw something fall down. And certainly, I am not conscious of the words in the same way as when I read what another person is writing, by looking over his shoulder. But that does not mean that I am conscious of myself as writing. The essential differences are these. So they're both non-reflective. First, that my intuitive understanding of what my neighbor is writing is of the type of probable evidence. I grasp the words traced by his hand some time before he has traced them completely. But at the moment when reading indup, I intuitively seize upon the word independent. This word independent presents itself as a probable reality, like the table or the chair. On the other hand, my intuitive grasp of the words that I myself am writing delivers them to me as certainties, instead of like intuitive best guesses, or like kind of trying to matchmake or abductively figure out what the word is going to become. The certitude in this case is a little peculiar, for it is not certain that the word certitude, which I am in the act of writing, will appear. Because I may go crazy or change my mind, etc. But it is certain that if it does appear, it will appear as such. Thus, the activity constitutes a succession of certain objects in a probable world. Or let us say, if you will, that they are probable considered as future realities, but certain as potentialities of the world. Secondly, the words written by my neighbor make no demands on me. I contemplate them as they appear in succession, as I might look at a table or a suitcase. The words that I am writing, on the contrary, are exigent, so they are urgent need or demand. It is the precise manner in which I grasp them in the course of my creative activity that makes them what they are. They are potentialities that have to be realized, not that have to be realized by me. They are unique to each person or each perspective, each affective historicity, each subject position, but they're non-reflective. They're not things that have to be realized by me, by the perceiving subject. The self does not appear at all in this. I simply feel the pull they exert. I feel their exigence objectively. I see them realizing themselves and at the same time demanding further realization. I can very well think that the words my neighbor is writing demand their realization from him, but I do not feel that demand. On the contrary, the exigence of the words that I am tracing is directly present, weighty, and felt. They, the exigences, impel and direct my hand, but not as though little demons, alive and active, were driving and guiding it, in fact. This is a passive exigence. As for my hand, I am conscious of it in the sense that I see it before me as the instrument whereby the words realize themselves. It is an object in the world, but one that is at the same time present and lived. And he'll say this again about this dual nature of perceiving the hand, of the body. The dual nature of the body is lived by consciousness, but also an object in the world. Here for a moment I hesitate. Shall I write then or consequently? This does not in the least imply that I am falling back upon myself in a reflective fashion, but simply that the two possibilities then and consequently, but only as possibilities, appear and enter into conflict in aesthetic consciousness, right? Non-reflective consciousness is not non-thetic consciousness. We're not like absent-minded in non-reflective consciousness. I would say that sometimes philosophers talk about pre-reflective consciousness, and this is more non-thetic. But all of this aesthetic, attentive, caring, focused, right? It's just non-reflective at the same time because reflective is a certain kind of attention, perception of perception. It's a second order. Yeah. So it's the integration. It's the integral. I think Sartre and Bergson both use integral of experience. Um, it's the second order synthesis, where a derivative would go from a quadratic to a linear, or x squared to x with x to the one power, the first power, and an integral goes from x to the first power to x to the second power, the second magnitude. Apperception, reflective consciousness, consciousness of consciousness, metacognition, etc. We shall try elsewhere to describe the world one acts upon. What is important here is only to show that activity as spontaneous, unreflecting consciousness constitutes us, and when he says spontaneous, he means agent-driven, self-directed, non-deterministic, freedom. Yeah, he means freedom, free action. So spontaneity is associated with freedom for Sartre. Um, what is important here is only to show that activity as spontaneous, unreflecting consciousness constitutes a certain existential stratum in the world, and that in order to act, there is no need to be conscious of oneself as acting. Quite the contrary. In a word, unreflective conduct is not unconscious conduct. It is non-thetically conscious of self. And its way of being conscious of self is to transcend and apprehend itself out in the world as a quality of things. In this way, we can understand all those exigences and those tensions of the world around us. In this way, we can draw up a hodological chart. I'll explain what hodological means. We can draw up a hodological chart of our Umwelt, or world. Our Umwelt is our lived world. He explains it on the next page. That which the Germans call the Umwelt, the world around us, the world of our desires, our needs, and of our activities, the life world. So he's going to describe, and this is these life paths were of Lewin as well. So, and that's what hodological means. Hodology is the study of paths, and hodological space in Lewin is the life paths or the potential directions, affective capacities you have. The affective capacities you've already traveled, picked up, impacted on others, had them impact on you and your historicity. And then the affective capacities that you carry forward as skills and potentialities for your future. Um, this is hodology, in a word. It's the study of paths. Okay. In this way, we can draw up a hodological chart of our Umwelt, a chart that will vary in function with our actions and our needs. Only in a normal and well-adapted activity, the objects, quote, to be realized, present themselves as needing to be realized in specific ways. So it's like means end reasoning of the deterministic world. And he calls this the pragmatic intuition of the determinism of the world. So pragmatic meaning functional, right? Drawing on the last 30 years, because this is happening kind of contemporary, 60 years. Peirce was probably 20 or 30 years before James. The means themselves, this is Sartre again, the means themselves appear to us as potentialities that lay claim to existence. So they have a sort of self-creation, the exigences of the world. This apprehension of the means as the one possible path to the attainment of the end, or if there are end means as the invariable means that alone are possible for the attainment of the end, may be called the pragmatic intuition of the determinism of the world. From this point of view, the world around us, that which the Germans call the Umwelt, the world of our desires, our needs, and of our activities, appears to be all furrowed with straight and narrowed paths leading to such and such determinate end. That is the appearance of a created object. Naturally, here and there, and to some extent everywhere, there are pitfalls and traps. One might compare this world to one of those pen tables, where for a penny in the slot, you can set the little balls rolling. There are pathways traced between hedges of pens, and holes pierced where the pathways cross one another. Sorry, one second. All right. Took a minute to find some examples of these mazes, and this is kind of what I imagine Sartre talking about all the time, is these things where you have to like rotate. So you can turn the knobs to kind of lift them in different ways. Um, and or if it's like a pocket one like this, I used to get these as toys from different places, like fast food places, and uh, I don't know where I'd get them, honestly. But this is the hodological space. Pitfalls and traps, failures, narrow paths to success. Naturally, here and there, and to some extent everywhere, there are pitfalls and traps. One might compare this world to one of those pen tables where, for a penny in the slot, you can set the little balls rolling. There are pathways traced between hedges of pens and holes pierced where the pathways cross one another. The ball is required, right? So pathways cross between hedges, these like little barriers that are up the maze itself, and then holes where the pathways cross. And so you have to like wiggle them around the holes very carefully. The ball is required to complete a predetermined course, making use of the required paths and without dropping into the holes. And usually the way it happens is that when it drops into the hole, there's an under table, like in the billiards, like a pool table, where it will return it to the main centralized position. So you can get it from like a little output that it has near the start of the maze and then try the maze again. Um, without dropping into the holes. This world is difficult. And remember, he's comparing this to like our world, the deterministic world, the hodological world of rational means and reasoning. The notion of difficulty here is not a reflexive notion, which would imply a relation to oneself. It's non-reflective. It is out there in the world. It is a quality of the world given to perception. just as are the paths to the possible goals, the possibilities themselves, and the exigences of objects, books that ought to be read, shoes to be resold, etc. It is the noetic correlate of the activity we have undertaken. Remember where noetic is the nous, or the sort of mind um, perceptual state of consciousness, kind of, or have only conceived. The activity we have undertaken or have only conceived. Um, and this is where we switch. We can now conceive what an emotion is. It is a transformation of the world. When the paths before us become too difficult, or when we cannot see our way, we can no longer put up with such an exacting and difficult world. All ways are barred, and nevertheless we must act. So then we try to change that world. That is, to live it as though the relations between things and their potentialities were not governed by deterministic processes, but by magic. So in the next few pages, he'll describe the magical world, or how this breaks down. And this breakdown from the deterministic world to the magical world is the kind of transformation of form that is functional. There is a gestalt form to the field theory that is experienced, the deterministic form. And Sartre says, um, I can understand the breakdown of the form whenever things become too difficult, but I can't understand the reconstitution of the new form of the magical world, or the attitude or the emotion, the magical attitude or the whatever emotion is given, um, unless it was given by a transformation of the breakdown of the deterministic world. That is to live the world as though we try to change the world. That is to live it as though the relations between things and their potentialities were not governed by deterministic processes, but by magic. But be it well understood, this is no playful matter. We are cornered, and we fling ourselves into this new attitude with all the force at our commands. Note also that our effort is not conscious of what it is, for then it would be the object of a reflection. It would be reflective consciousness. It is above all the seizure of new relationships and new demands. It's something more structural, and um, it's a transformation of the relations of the world, but that's a seizure of new relations and new demands. To put it simply, since the seizure of one object is impossible or sets up an unbearable tension, the consciousness seizes or tries to seize it otherwise. That is, tries to transform itself in order to transform the object. In itself, this change in the direction of the consciousness is nothing remarkable. So it's a reversal of the direction. We can find numerous examples of similar transformations of activity and of perception. For instance, to search for a shape that is dissimulated in a picture puzzle, such as where's the gun, is to deploy one's perceptivity towards the picture in a new way. It is to scan the branches, the telegraph posts, etc. in the picture as if one were looking at a gun. It is to carry out the ocular movements that one would make in seeing a gun. But we do not perceive these movements as such. By means of these movements, an intuition which transcends them, and of which these movements constitute the hyal, or matter that the intuition gives form to, because it's an eidetic intuition, which is an eidos, or an essence, or a form, scrutinizes the trees and posts that are seized upon. So the movements constitute the matter for the eidetic intuition that is searching for a specific kind of thing. This is similar to how, this is basically what Descartes talks about with the wax and with the um, potential automatons, the men in coats, where he only sees coats and hats, but he pierces through and he judges that the form of of the matter that he is perceiving is humans wearing those things, which is why perception is fundamentally mental judgment or scrutiny. And we're just kind of digging more into that here. By means of, but we do not perceive these movements as such in a reflective way to carry out the outcome movements that one would make in seeing a gun. So the perception and the activity kind of reverse direction or become a similar thing. Um, there's like a non-thetic stimuli or a non-thetic intention And I think that's the word he'll use, is that it's an intention. Um, in the same way, we must conceive the change of intention and of behavior. So this goal or end in mind, the eidos that we seek to perceive, projects onto the matter, and we make sense of it when we recognize what we're looking for. But we do not perceive these movements as such by means of them an eidetic intuition, which transcends them and of which they constitute the hyle or base matter in an Aristotelian sense of that which defines some or gives something its suchness. Um, Scrutinizes the trees and posts that are seized upon as possible guns until suddenly the perception crystallizes and the gun appears. Thus, through a change of intention, as in a change of behavior, we apprehend an object, new or old, in a different fashion. We need not first take up a position on the reflective plane. The instructions under the picture provide the immediate motivation, and we look for the gun without leaving the non-reflective plane. A potential gun has appeared, vaguely localized in the picture. It is in the same way that we must conceive the change of intention and of behavior which characterizes emotion. The impossibility of finding a solution to the problem is apprehended objectively, as a quality of the world. This serves to motivate the new unreflective consciousness which now grasps the world differently under a new aspect and imposes a new behavior through which that aspect is grasped. And this again serves as hyle for the new intention, where the intention gives the raw noise a sort of form once it matches up properly. Once you find the formula, the appropriate fit. We've also talked about how intuition, like in Bergson's sense, instead of analysis, can always kind of map onto different analyses, but the analysis can't go to the intuition. So we can think of the analyses as like the hyle or the like broad noise of oplanum matter. And whenever we pattern it in a certain way with a form or an eidos or an eidetic intuition, um, it fits. And we isolate that perception as a thing amongst other perceptions. Similar to how John Dewey talks about the premises and the conclusion arise in relation to each other. Um, you see all three at once. You don't just start with two propositions and then draw the conclusion. You recognize the whole aesthetic consummation of the connectedness of the information. Um, you have a raw hyle, a raw paragraph or set of texts, but when you start looking to make a certain argument or see the pattern or construct a given form, then you'll notice it in certain places and can draw it out. But emotional conduct is not on the same plane as other kinds of behavior. It is not effectual. Its aim is not really to act upon the object as it is, but the interpolation of particular means. Emotional behavior seeks by itself and without modifying the structure of the object to confer another quality upon it, a lesser existence or a lesser presence, or a greater existence, etc. In a word, during emotion, it is the body which, directed by the consciousness, changes its relationship with the world, so that the world should change its qualities. Right? We can't change the world, so we change our body to try to change the relation between the body world, a new structural relationship. If emotion is play acting, the play is one that we believe in. A simple example will serve to explain this emotive structure. Um, he says, before we even read this, he says, in this case, the comedy is only half sincere, but let the situation be more critical. Let the incantatory behavior be maintained in all seriousness for survival. And there you have emotion. So let's read his example, which he takes to be, a little aloof or a little comedic. Um, he calls it a little comedy that he plays. Anyway, a simple example will serve to explain this emotive structure of the transformation of the body to um, create a new intentional relationship with the world when one cannot change the world. I lift my hand to pluck a bunch of grapes. I cannot do so. They are beyond my reach. So I shrug my shoulders, muttering, they are too green. So I change my perception of the world and go on my way. The gestures, words, and behavior that are not to be taken at face value. This little comedy that I play under the grapes, thereby conferring this quality of being, quote, too green upon them, serves as a substitute for the action I cannot complete. He can't reach them. They're too high up. And he says that he can't taste their too sweetness, but he knows that grapes that are too green are usually too sweet. And so he just like pretends that they're too green, so they'll be too sweet. And so it doesn't matter that I can't reach them, right? The deterministic world breaks down for him. And Sartre decides, "Ah, I didn't need it anyway. I didn't want it." A change of desire, a change of intention. Um, they presented themselves at first as, quote, ready for gathering. But this attractive quality soon becomes intolerable when the potentiality cannot be actualized because they're beyond his reach. The disagreeable tension becomes, in its turn, a motive for seeing another quality in those grapes, their being, quote, too green, which will resolve the conflict and put an end to the tension. Only I cannot confer this quality upon the grapes chemically, by taste, that they're too sweet. So I seize upon the tartness of grapes that are too green by putting on the behavior of disrelish. I confer the required quality upon the grapes magically. In this case, the comedy is only half sincere, but let the situation be more critical. Let the incantatory behavior be maintained in all seriousness, and there you have emotion. All right, guys. So far, we've covered static and non-reflective, determinism, deterministic world, and the breakdown of the deterministic world in non-reflective ways. That's not unconscious, and it's not something we escape responsibility from. Um, and now we're going to talk about some specific emotions as functions of transforming the world when presented with an inability to meet the demands of the deterministic world. And again, this is the functional transformation through perception and consciousness of the deterministic world, which has strict relations of causality, into the magical world, which is kind of bare bones, phenomenal, colorful, social, emotional, fearful, wonderful. He talks about in these next few pages, again, passive fear, then passive sadness, then active sadness, then joy. And he later talks about horror and wonder as the sudden shift from the deterministic world into the magical world, the sudden plunge. Horror is when it's negative, wonder is when it's positive. Um, yeah. Take, for example, passive fear. I see a ferocious beast coming towards me. My legs give way under me. My heart beats more feebly. I turn pale, fall down, and faint away. No conduct could seem worse adapted to the danger than this, which leaves me defenseless. And nevertheless, it is a behavior of escape. The fainting away is a refuge. But let no one suppose that it is a refuge for me, that I am trying to save myself, so not non-reflective, or to see no more of the ferocious beast. I have not come out of the non-reflective plane. But being unable to escape the danger by normal means and deterministic procedures, I have denied existence to it. I have tried to annihilate it. The urgency of the danger was the motive for this attempt to annihilate it, which called for magical behavior. And in the event, I have annihilated it so far as was in my power. Such are the limitations of my magical power over the world. I can suppress it as an object of consciousness, but only by suppressing consciousness itself, or at least by modifying it. And fainting one passes into a dreaming consciousness, that is, into one of unrealization or perhaps dissociation. Let it not be thought that the physiological behavior in passive fear is pure disorder. It represents an abrupt realization of the bodily conditions which ordinarily accompany the passage from the waking state to sleep, the fainting away. And then active fear. Instead of fainting away, we have flight. Flight in active fear is mistakenly supposed to be rational behavior. It is thought to contain calculation, admittedly brief, by the subject who wants to put the greatest possible distance between the danger and himself. But that is a misunderstanding of this behavior, which would reduce it to prudence. We do not take flight to reach shelter. We flee because we are unable to annihilate ourselves in unconsciousness. Flight is fainting away in play. It is magical behavior which negates the dangerous object with one's whole body by reversing the vectorial structure of the space we live in and suddenly creating a potential direction on the other side. It is a way of forgetting, of negating the danger. It is in precisely the same way that an untrained boxer flings himself at his adversary with his eyes shut. He wants to suppress the existence of the other's fists. By refusing to see them, he symbolically eliminates their efficacy. The real meaning of fear is now becoming apparent to us. It is a consciousness whose aim is to negate something in the external world by means of magical behavior, and will go so far as to annihilate itself in order to annihilate the object also. Passive sadness is characterized, as we know, by dejected behavior. There is muscular relaxation, paleness, and cold at the extremities. One turns away towards some corner to sit there motionless, making the least possible contact with the world. So, like melancholy or dissociation, or just, and this is when we can't, when we don't have the means to take care of some things and we don't find the new means. One prefers twilight to full daylight, silence to sound, and solitude in one's room, to frequented roads and public places. Quote, to be alone, as they say, quote, with one's sorrow. But that is not true at all. It is good form, of course, to appear to meditate deeply over one's grief. But cases in which a sorrow is really cherished are rather rare. There is quite another reason. One of the accustomed conditions of our activity has vanished, yet we are still required to act in and upon the world without it. Most of the potentialities of our world, work to be done, people to see, duties of the daily round to be accomplished, remain the same. Only the means for realizing them, the paths traced over our hodological space, have changed. If, for example, I have just learned that I am ruined, I no longer dispose of the same means, a private car, etc., to accomplish them. I shall have to substitute means new to me, such as taking the motor bus, etc., which is precisely what I do not want to do. My melancholy is a method of suppressing the obligation to look for these new ways by transforming the present structure of the world, replacing it with a totally undifferentiated structure. So you flatten the world. What it comes to, in short, is that I make the world into an affectively neutral reality, a system which is affectively in complete equilibrium. Objects highly charged with affect. He's not using it this way, but remember that affect is causal and felt and experienced. It's not just emotion and feeling, but it's also causation. Objects highly charged with affect, historically highly charged with affect through the imbued labor and interpretive meaning in perception, are decharged, brought down to affective zero, and therefore apprehended as perfectly equivalent and interchangeable. In other words, lacking both the ability and the will to carry out the projects I formerly entertained, I behave in such a manner that the universe requires nothing more from me. This one can do only by acting upon oneself, by, quote, lowering the flame of life to a pinpoint. And the noetic correlate of this attitude is what we call bleakness. The universe is bleak, that is, of undifferentiated structure. At the same time, therefore, we naturally draw back into ourselves, we efface ourselves, and the noetic counterpart of that is the refuge. The entire universe is bleak, and it is precisely in order to protect ourselves from its frightful, illimitable monotony that we make some place or other into a, quote, shelter. That is the one differentiating factor in the absolute monotony of the world, a bleak wall, a little darkness to screen us from that bleak immensity. Right? We put up a little bleakness of our own construction to minimize the total bleakness. Active sadness, in contrast with passive sadness, can take many forms, but the one cited by Janet of the psychasthenic who throws a fit of nerves because she does not want to make her confession may be characterized as a refusal. It exemplifies, again, remember, she fully believes it. It's non-reflective and she is not conscious of it, and we could not become conscious of it. But by asserting responsibility and putting it back into the spontaneous freedom of the agent, we regain any, in a sort of Jamesian way, we reclaim, we take ownership of any modicum of freedom that we actually might have, only by believing that we have it. So I don't think he's doing this to be like condescending or hierarchical about moral failures. He's doing this to um, put it in people's consciousnesses that they can be better. And yeah, uh, he says in existentialism is a humanism, which is not here, that every action I take is a legislative action, like in the Kantian sense, for everyone else to take that same action under similar circumstances. So every action is a legislation. Um, which phenomenologically makes a lot of sense because every action transforms the world and sets up the synthetic totality in a further development. Active sadness can take many, to make a confession may be characterized as a refusal. It exemplifies above all a negative behavior intended to deny the urgency of certain problems and to replace them by others. The patient wants to move Janet's feelings. This means that she wants to change his attitude of impassible expectancy into one of affectionate concern. She wants this, and she makes use of her body to bring it about. At the same time, by putting herself into such a state that the confession would be impossible, she is renouncing that act as beyond her power. Now and for as long as she is in tears and shaken with her sobbing, all possibility of speaking is taken from her. Here then the potentiality is not eliminated. The confession remains, quote, to be made, but it has retreated beyond the reach of the patient who can no longer will to make it, but only hope to do so one day. The This is interesting that he says freed in this sense. The patient has thus freed herself from the painful feeling that the act was in her power, from her former freedom. She has freed herself from her former freedom, that she was free to do it or not. The emotional crisis here is an abandonment of responsibility by means of a magical exaggeration of the difficulty of the world. The world retains its differentiated structure, but it appears unjust and hostile because it is demanding too much of us, that is, more than it is humanly possible to do. In this case, then, the emotion of sadness is a magical play acting of impotence. The patient is like one of those domestic servants who, having admitted burglars to their master's house, get them to bind them hand and foot as a clear demonstration that they could not have prevented the theft. Here, however, the patient ties herself up in a number of tenuous bonds. It might be said, perhaps, that the painful sense of liberty, of which the patient wants to rid herself, is necessarily of a reflective nature. But this we do not believe, and one has only to watch oneself to see what really happens. It is the object which presents itself as demanding to be freely created, the confession which presents itself as the deed which both ought to and can be done. So the freedom is non-reflective, and the exigences which are free do not come from this self. Because that makes a lot of sense. But we're still responsible for them. There are, of course, but I mean, it does actually kind of expand the understanding of what the self is and make it a being singular plural in Nancy's phrase. This is the shift. No, this is where we go to joy. So he's going to skip over anger and then talk about joy as the immediate attainment, the false immediate attainment of the desired thing or person. There are, of course, other functions and other forms of active sadness. We will say no more about anger, which we have discussed at length already, and which, of all the emotions, is perhaps the most evidently functional. But what is to be said about joy? Because joy is like not, so he's going to mention sexual sadism. Um, unless he already did that one. He might have already talked about that, but it's an example of a sort of quote unquote positive emotion, um, instead of an avoidance, a functional avoidance. So we've seen functional avoidances or fainting away from the world, the fears and the sadnesses. The anger isn't, it's kind of an avoidance, but it's more like a diversion or a distraction, a, an excess of force to overcome impotence. Um, and so it's of a different form or of a different function and form. Well, even active sadness has other functions and other forms, but it's of a completely different contour than the fears and the sadnesses. And then in the third category, you have joy, which is a sort of false pursuance. So we've had false avoidance, and anger is also a kind of false pursuance because it's a false force. It doesn't have the conviction of truth, the force of truth, which is conviction, which doesn't need any kind of added spice like anger. But what is to be said about joy? Does it fit into our description? At first sight, it would seem not, since the joyful subject has no need to defend himself against a belittling or dangerous charge, or belittling or dangerous change. So we can see those as defenses. I really would see anger more as a pursuance than an avoidance. Um, they're all defenses. Even joy is a defense at a sort of avoidance of being disappointed by the inability to ever attain the person fully or the thing fully. But it's also a pursuance of that. And in a way, um, we could try to parse what the fears and the sadnesses were pursuances of in alternative, what the magical pursuant was, an alternative to the deterministic avoidant. I'm trying to think about avoidance and pursuance because they're two of the kleshas in Buddhism. So they're two kind of main categories of avoiding presence or avoiding self-satisfaction or self-culmination, and a sort of ethical realization, right? Fear and desire is how Buddhism talks about them. So yeah, fear is an avoidance, um, and joy is a sort of pursuance. But I think they could both be, I think all of the emotions could be both at the same time. Which is why you have to get the third klesha, which is right view, and perceive the world properly, perceive yourself properly, metaphysically and ethically. But we must first distinguish between the joyful feeling which betokens an equilibrium or a state of adaptation, which is the eudaimonic joy that we've mentioned many times, happiness in the Greek classical sense of well-being and thriving, an equilibrium or a state of adaptation, a sort of contentment and harmony and peace, in contrast with emotional joy. For the latter, emotional joy, on closer consideration, is characterized by a certain impatience. So it really is a pursuance because of that impatience. We mean by this that the joyful subject is behaving very much like a man in a state of impatience. He cannot keep still, makes innumerable plans, begins to do things which he immediately abandons, etc. For in fact, this joy has been called up by an apparition of the object of his desires. And there we have desire. So it does fit into those Buddhist categories, which are always helpful to keep in mind. He has been told that he has won a considerable sum of money, or that he will shortly meet someone he loves and is not seen for a long time. But although the object is imminent, not yet. It's not imminent with an A, it's imminent with an I. So it's temporally imminent, IMMINENT, versus eminence of life, which we talked about earlier from Deleuze and is in contrast with transcendence. That kind of immanence has an A, IMMANENCE. Although the object is imminent, it is not yet there, it is not yet his. He is separated from it by a certain length of time, And even when it is present, even when the friend so long desired appears upon the station platform, he is still an object that delivers itself to one only little by little. The delight that we feel in seeing him again soon becomes blunted. We shall never get so far as to hold him there in front of us as our own absolute possession and to grasp him all at once as a whole. Nor shall we ever realize all at once our new won riches as an instantaneous totality. It will yield itself to us only through numberless details and, as it were, by Abschätzungen. This is the way that the immanent singularities come back with this sort of reality of the partial exposures to surface level phenomenon and givenness, which identically adumbrate all the other things that we can derive from them. It's not a hollow plainness. It's not a mere suchness. Um, it signifies. These Abschätzungen are meaningful. They adumbrate the signification of all other things and for the developments of dialectic and discourse. And interrogation, that's why you can interrogate the phenomena, because of the Abschätzungen. Joy is magical behavior which tries by incantation or a ritualistic sort of instantiation to realize the possession of the desired object as an instantaneous totality. This behavior is accompanied by certainty that possession will be realized sooner or later, but it seeks to anticipate that possession. The various activities expressive of joy, as well as the muscular hypertonicity and the slight vascular dilatation. It's not dilation, it is dilatation. And I think when I looked that up, it was that dilatation was passive and dilation was active. And the slight vascular dilatation are animated and transcended by an intention which envisages the world through them. This seems easy. The object of our desires appears to be near and easy to possess. Every gesture expresses emphatic approbation, to dance or to sing for joy. These represent the behavior of symbolic approximation, of incantation. By their means, the object, which in reality one may not be able to possess except by prudent and after all difficult behavior, is possessed at once. Symbolically, it is thus, for example, that a man to whom a woman has just said that she loves him may begin to dance and sing. In so doing, he turns his mind away from the prudent and difficult behavior he will have to maintain if he is to deserve this love and increase it, to gain possession of it through countless details, smiles, little attentions, etc. He turns away even from the woman herself as the living reality representative of all those delicate procedures. Those he will attend to later. He is now giving himself a rest. For the moment, he is possessing the object by magic. The dance mimes his possession of it. And that wraps up the end of like the survey of particular motions to see their function. However, we cannot be quite content with these few observations. They have enabled us to appreciate the functional part played by emotion, but we still do not know very much about its nature. Right, and I think that is also kind of where I've historically. I think we get to page 49 in my former sections. What's on 49? I think we may read these two pages in both this episode and the next one, but I want to probably wrap this and instead of doing like a 3 hour episode, because I think maybe the next one will be shorter, but it's definitely going to be a minute. Let's go a little bit further. So we must note, first of all, that the few examples we have cited are far from having exhausted all the varieties of emotion. Many other fears are possible, many other kinds of sadness. We are only affirming that they are all reducible to the constitution of a magical world, by making use of our bodies as instruments of incantation. Let's say that again. We are only affirming that all emotions are all reducible to the constitution of a magic world by making use of our bodies as instruments of incantation. In every case, the problem is different and the behavior is different. To grasp the signification and aim, one would have to know and analyze each particular situation. Broadly speaking, there are not four principal types of emotion, there are many more. And it would be a useful, I guess this four would be that he's gone over, would be fear, sadness, anger, and joy. There are not four principal types of emotion, there are many more, and it would be a useful and productive work to classify them. For example, if the fear of a timid person changes suddenly into anger, this anger is not of the ordinary type, it is fear suppressed. And so the fear of a timid person changes suddenly into anger, this change of conduct motivated by a change in the situation. Fear surpassed. This does not mean at all that it is in some way reducible to fear, but simply that it retains the antecedent fear included in its own structure. And which is why the world, when it transforms, contains the imbuements of the affective labor inscribed upon it and can historically adumbrate and eidetically reveal that history of action and labor done upon the object, which retains the traces of the transformation of the world, both deterministically and emotionally, magically. But it is only when one is persuaded of the functional character of emotion that one can arrive at an understanding of the infinite variety of states of emotional consciousness. On the other hand, we ought never to lose sight of one capital fact, that behavior pure and simple is not emotion, any more than is the pure and simple awareness of that behavior. If it were so, indeed, the finalist character of emotion would be far more clearly apparent. And on the other hand, consciousness could easily free itself from emotion. It would be reflective. It would be something we could change. So, I mean, Sartre is maybe not clearly, but he is repeatedly saying that we are spontaneous in our emotion and we are non-reflective and cannot change it or cannot free ourselves from it. We could perhaps find different emotions. Moreover, there are spurious emotions which are nothing more than behavior. Um, so here it's kind of confusing. Here he's talking about, and then he's going to go to real emotion, which is the end of the next page, and their real emotion is something we cannot change. Right? We undergo real emotion. Versus spurious or kind of fleeting or kind of false emotions. It's falsity in an existential sense because it's bad faith. Of our own accord, we would not be joyful, but we want to be socially kind. So we are throwing ourselves into, it's kind of performative. And that's when he talks about spurious emotions, he means they're kind of performative, but they're not performative in the sense that an actor performs emotions because an actor actually does not feel those emotions. According to Sartre, I think there are actors or methods that can lean into um, the environmental production, the non-reflective environmental production in the moment of an emotion, like he is talking about. Um, I might draw some distinctions between the theatrical acting and movie acting, since theatrical acting happens in one take with an audience in a present felt environment, and movie acting happens um, in multiple takes with different cuts of perception and viewpoint of the camera. It does still happen with a receptive audience of the directors and crew and cast and the other cast members, but because of the repeated nature of the takes, typically consistency is more important in movie making than authenticity is important in theatrics in the theater. There is some consistency of coordination and blocking and having the same performance each night, but there's more openness in a theatrical performance for the emotion to organically unfold. And so then it would be more like letting myself be a little carried away versus movie acting would be like not feeling it at all, I think, pretty clearly. Except for those characters who are so method acting that they even are horrible or whatever in their character towards set members, even when the set is off. And that's very dangerous. Um, because it's not just done for an hour every night, it's done in all the downtime as well. That's why I usually, um, for example, there's an actor named Heath Ledger who died at a young age, uh, and was known for this intense method acting. Played the Joker in some of the Dark Knight series movies. Really talented and kind and good person. So we have like kind of three examples. We have receiving a gift where you let yourself like pretend happiness and you are actually happy. You're grateful, but you're being more expressive about it than you might be normally. And I do think that theatrical acting in a one-shot situation follows this format, even though, and then Sartre talks about acting further below. And I think that kind of acting is more reserved to these mechanical actors who really don't feel it and they have to just kind of present the surface instead. And then on the next page, it says it has a parasitic reality, but when I desist from my incantations, this will immediately disappear. And then real emotion is undergone. We're spellbound. It's a genuine phenomena of belief. Um, we truly believe emotion. We throw ourselves into it with all our might. So let's get to real emotion and then we'll cut and then we'll come back for real emotion. Moreover, there are spurious emotions which are nothing more than behavior, because emotion is not just behavior. If someone gives me a present in which I am only half interested, I may make an outward show of intense delight. I may clap my hands, jump, or dance. This, however, is only play acting. I let myself be a little carried away by it, and it would be inaccurate to say that I am not joyful. Nevertheless, my delight is not genuine. I shall throw it off as soon as my visitor has gone. This is precisely what we call false joy, bearing in mind that falsity is not a logical characteristic of certain propositions, like formal logic, but an existential quality of faith or we may have already gone over where he talks about bad faith. I have it circled, but either way, I don't think it's right here. But you can, the inauthenticity or the existential quality of falsity is related to the faithfulness or the um, asserting my own reality with an honesty towards myself and a self-integrity of what I want and what I value. In the same sense, I can have false fears, false sorrows. Such false states of mind are, however, quite distinct from those of the actor. An actor imitates joy, sorrow, etc., without being joyful or sorrowful, for his behavior is addressed to a fictional world. He imitates behavior, but is not himself behaving. So, yeah, even theatrical acting would go in here because it has to do with the sort of, you know, when it's real or not. And this would only break down for people who have a hard time um, determining reality from imagination or hallucination or paranoia or whatever. There are different states of there are different names or bundles of phenomena in psychological conditions or disorders, things, phrases I want to just avoid. I don't want to say that they're pathology. Let's use the word pathology, not a disorder. There are various pathologies that can result in that breakdown between reality and mind or hallucination or magic. Um, and people who have those sorts of breakdowns, I think they could still probably, because you know, you get attached to characters. Um, You get attached, you were watching like a long series and you have emotional movements to the artwork. You're in the fictional world. You have emotional relations to a fictional world. So I would imagine that even an actor could do that at some point. And even without a pathology. So I kind of want to push back against Sartre here, just aesthetically. Dufresne writes about the world of the aesthetic object, and it always kind of interested me or made me feel that there was the same intuitive capacity involved in ethically world traveling from Maria Lugones and aesthetically traveling to the world of the aesthetic object. Okay. Without being joyful or sorrowful, his behavior is addressed to a fictional world. Sorrowful. He imitates behavior but is not himself behaving. In the various cases of false emotion that I have just mentioned, the behavior is not sustained by anything. It exists alone and is voluntary. But the situation is real and is thought to require such behavior. Moreover, through such behavior, we magically will certain qualities upon real objects. But those qualities are false. It must not be supposed that they are therefore imaginary. They're false but not imaginary, nor that they are bound to vanish away later. Their falsity is that of an essential weakness pretending to be violence. My pleasure in the object I have just been given exists much more as a duty than as a reality. It has a sort of parasitic reality, as a tribute. Of that I am very well aware. I know that I am endowing the object with it by a kind of fascination, but when I desist from my incantations, this will immediately disappear. Real emotion is quite another matter. It is accompanied by belief. The qualities willed upon the objects are taken to be real. What exactly is to be understood by that? This, or almost this, that the emotion is undergone. One cannot get out of it as one pleases. It fades away of itself, but one cannot put a stop to it. Furthermore, the behavior, viewed simply in itself, imprints upon the object no more than a schematic suggestion of the quality one is attributing to it. Merely to run away from it would not be enough to constitute an object as horrifying, or rather, this might confer the formal quality horrifying upon it, but not the substance of that quality. If we are really to be seized by horror, the substance of that quality, we have not only to mime it, we must be spellbound and filled to overflowing by our own emotion. The shape and form of our behavior must be filled with something opaque and weighty that gives it substance. Here we can understand the part played by the purely physiological phenomena. They represent the genuineness of the emotion. They are the phenomena of belief. True, they must not be separated from the behavior. In the first place, they present a certain analogy with it. The hypotonicity in fear or in sadness, the vascular constrictions and respiratory troubles are symbolical enough, together with a behavior which is trying to negate the world or to discharge it of its potential by negating its own consciousness, by negating itself. It is hence impossible to mark exactly the frontier between pure troubles and behavior. And secondly, they combine with the behavior in one whole synthetic form and are not to be studied for their own sake. To have considered them in isolation was precisely the error of the peripheric theory. And nevertheless, they are not reducible. Emotions are not reducible to behavior. One can stop oneself from running, but not from trembling. I can, by a violent effort, rise from my chair, dismiss from my mind the disaster that has overcome me, and set myself to work, but my hands remain ice cold. Emotion then cannot be regarded simply as play acting, even though we do it to avoid, to change the deterministic world. I mean, some of the language he used before this was very harsh, but here he's saying explicitly it is truly undergone, even though it's spontaneous. It is not mere behavior, not simply as play acting, but the behavior of a body which is in a specific state. The state itself would not give rise to the behavior. That's the peripheric theory. The behavior without the state is play acting, but the emotion appears in a disordered body carrying on a certain kind of behavior. The bodily disturbance may continue longer than the behavior, but the behavior constitutes the form and the signification of the disorder. So here we have the bodily disturbance, the bodily reaction, the behavior, and he's not mentioning that third category from the introduction in the three things, which is the state of consciousness or the finality or the phenomenological quality of emotion. On the other hand, the behavior without this disorder would be mere signification and emotional schema. The form we have to do with is indeed synthetic. To believe in magical behavior, we must be physically upset. It has to have all three. to create the kind of culminative synthetic state of consciousness, which we find is actually in the world itself and is in the behavior and is in bodily reactions. Clearly, to understand the emotional process as it proceeds from consciousness, we must remember the dual nature of the body, which on the one hand is an object in the world, and on the other is immediately lived by the consciousness. Only then can we grasp what is essential, that emotion is a phenomenon of belief. Consciousness does not limit itself to the projection of affective meanings upon the world around it. It lives the new world. It is thereby constituted, lives it directly, commits itself to it, and suffers from the qualities that the concomitant behavior has outlined. This means that all ways out being barred, the consciousness leaps into the magical world of emotion, plunges wholly into it by debasing itself. It becomes a different consciousness, confronting a different world, a world which it constitutes with its own most intimate quality, with that presence to itself, utterly non-distant of its point of view upon the world. A consciousness becoming emotional is rather like a consciousness dropping asleep. The one, like the other, slips into another world and transforms the body as a synthetic whole so as to be able to live and to perceive this other world through it. In other words, the consciousness changes its body, or to put it another way, the body, considered as the point of view upon the universe, immediately inherent in consciousness, so as a sort of necessity derived from consciousness itself, is raised to the level of the behavior. That is why the physiological manifestations are, at bottom, disorders of the most ordinary description. They resemble those of fear, of angina pectoris, of artificial overexcitation, etc. They merely represent a complete and commonplace upset of the body, such as it is. The behavior alone will decide whether this disarray is to be a diminishment of life or an amplification of it, which is the two directions that the affective changes can augment. Every affective interaction, which is all of interaction, is augmenting, and it can increase or diminish, increase your powers or reduce them. And Deleuze talks about this as the two types of power, which are empowerment of the self and power from the outside, which shrinks the self. In nothing, it is nothing. It represents no more than an obscuration of the conscious point of view upon the world, insofar as the consciousness realizes and spontaneously lives this obscuration. It is advisable naturally to understand this obscuration as a synthetic phenomena, as indivisible. But since, on the other hand, the body is a thing among things, a scientific analysis may be able to distinguish in the biological body, in the body as a thing, the local disorder of this or that organ. Thus, the origin of emotion is a spontaneous debasement lived by consciousness in face of the world. What it is unable to endure in one way, it tries to seize in another way, by going to sleep, by reducing itself to the states of consciousness in sleep, dream, or hysteria. And the bodily disturbance is nothing else than the belief lived by the consciousness, as it is seen from outside. Only it must be noted. And then he's going to clarify a few things. He's going to clarify two things for 2 pages, and then say nevertheless and keep going. So we're going to stop here with this episode. Um, Thank you for being here, and I appreciate your engagement. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned a bunch. Um, and I'll be back and see you guys soon. Take care. Let me know if you need anything. Bye.